Good morning, everybody. This is Walk the Dog with Riot Mort, and it is Monday, a new week. The weekend was pretty solid. Definitely disconnected from work more than I usually do. Between the Magic pre-release that went well and I 3-0'd, and then Saturday, my wife and I had date night, which was great. The food was really good. Definitely got to a point, by the way, where it's like normally I could dust off one of those, a restaurant meal pretty easily. And this time I only ate about 80% of it. It was like, I'm getting full, and I understand that I am full, and I need to stop eating. So that was definitely a new experience I haven't had in a while. And then Sunday I ended up not going to Fantastic Four, but instead relaxing in my office, sorting Magic cards. So, yeah, so it was a good weekend. And now this week is more work on the thing I'm working on and a lot of interviews. A lot of interviews this week. I think I have like 2 today, 2 Wednesday, and 1 Thursday, which is, a lot of my time in a given week for interviews. But, that role is finally kicking into gear on some of these interviews. So, yeah, pretty interesting. So, the particular kit we're giving to these candidates, I think, is one of the harder ones. So, we'll see. A lot of people struggling. Like the few I've given out so far, they've been pretty difficult. So, and then on the PBE side of things, it's been interesting. It's been a very interesting PBE. Not just because of the whole, like, I'm not involved thing. Like, put that aside for a second. I think one of the more interesting things is, like, because there's so many, like, little mini tournaments between not just EWC, but also people were running all these other various tournaments. You saw stuff like YBY1 and Tidal doing their tournament, that, like, a lot of the quote-unquote tech isn't really being fully explored. It's like people have sort of found a couple lines that are, like, clearly quite good, and then those are the lines getting played. It's almost like, it feels like the first time in a long time I've seen that PBE is being played a little bit more like ladder for a lot of people, and a little less, let me just explore for funsies, at least at the top. And so, like I said, I think there's definitely the obvious sort of S tier stuff, and so I'll be curious to see how the team handles adjusting that, and how many, like, sort of unfound interactions there are, because, man, there are quite a few interactions that I Long Gwen being, I think, the biggest one we showed on stream. But yeah, pretty interesting. I will say, though, with everybody kind of like hiding their tech and doing their stuff for tournaments, it has meant my viewership's pretty good. We keep hitting like 6,000-7,000 per stream, which is kind of cool. Not that I haven't really paid attention to viewership much in a long time, but someone was pointing that out to me, and I was like, that's pretty cool. So, pretty neat. Okay, cool. Let's do some questions. Today's were pretty good. All right, first question. Donkey Kong Bonanza is a pretty easy game. Do you feel that DK reflects the trend of modern games being easier? All right. So I don't think using the term easier is the right terminology. At least when people in the games industry talk about video games, that's not actually what they're talking about. To put on your business hat for a second, what you have to think about and again, Nintendo's good at not doing this. Well, actually, no, that's not true. No, Nintendo is good at doing this, but they do it with good intentions. Whereas Western industry devs often do this with not bad intentions, but certainly different priorities. Allow me to explain. Basically, the idea here is that it's not about being easy or hard. The word of the day is accessible, right? You want your video game to be accessible, and the theory here is that by being accessible, you will have a larger audience, which leads to more potential revenue. That is the general high-level, thing that you hear from, like, product managers and things like that. Now, the reason I say Nintendo does this with good intentions is, one of the big differences when I went from Nintendo to Riot was like, Riot would always talk about how you'd have to figure out what your core audience is and what are those things. And they would do all these audience surveys of like, what type of player likes this game? Is it the 18 to 24-year-old, whatever? Is it like what type? Like, there's all these audience research studies that you could read. And Nintendo's like 5 to 95. People who can play, everyone should be able to enjoy our game in some way. And Nintendo, you can actually see a lot of the things they've tried to do over the years to make their games more accessible. I remember during my time at Nintendo, this was when Donkey Kong Returns was coming out and Mario, I want to say 3D World. But basically they had what was called the Super Guide. And this was a thing where if you died too many times, like a little special thing would appear that would either give you like invincibility in Mario's case, or in Donkey Kong's case, it would actually play the level for you. And it would allow you to get past something you might be stuck on, or maybe show you how to do it. And in theory, I'm actually okay with the Super Guide. I'm okay with accessibility. I remember when my daughter was 5 and she beat Mario 3D World, and she used it a couple times, but not a lot, and she was able to beat the game, and that was fine, right? Like, it didn't discourage her. It allowed her to enjoy the game and be accessible. And I think that's fine. I think having a game that lots of people can enjoy is a good thing. And so when I look at DK Bonanza, what I like about it is that, yes, if you play it the way it's quote unquote intended, it's a very easy game. They give you plenty of collectibles. There's lots of, the bosses are like very, very simple. There's not much challenge in that game. But one of the reasons I think that works for Nintendo is kind of like Dark Souls, actually, where you can set up enough various challenges and you can make it as difficult as you want it to be or not, right? Like, speedrunners are going to figure out ways to break the hell out of DK Bonanza. And the devs intentionally were like, that's fine. We want that to be a thing, right? If a 5-year-old's playing our game, they should have fun. And if a 20-year-old hardcore gamer's playing our game, they should have fun, right? And that kind of accessibility for the industry is a very good thing, okay? If that's your primary motivation for accessibility, that's great. Now, where I see this backfire, and I'm not saying anyone at Riot has done this, though the conversation has certainly come up. If you look at a game like TFT, I don't know that accessible is the word you would use. It's a pretty hard game. It requires a specific mindset. It's not like inaccessible, right? Like, at its core, I'd like to think it's a lot like Smash Brothers, right? Where anyone can buy units and get 3 of a kind, star them up, and place an army down, put some items on them, and have a good time. But obviously the skill depth is pretty deep, much like Smash Brothers. So, Smash Brothers, by the way, being, I think, one of the cornerstone examples of accessible but deep. And I think actually a lot of people who make platform fighters, that's why they screw up. They forget the accessible part. A lot of platform fighters that get made they lean into the hardcore too much and forget that 95% of Smash's audience is just people who buy it for the single player and to have a good time, But anyway, I think TFT has had times where people have been like, hey, this game's pretty hard. It's not very accessible. You should make it more accessible. And in a way, they're right. We should find ways to make more accessible. But the trick is finding out ways to make it more accessible without making that depth, that skill depth, shallower, right? Without making it less interesting to the people who already enjoy it. That's the challenge, right? So I think a good example of this is Talkers. Talkers is an example where it existing makes TFT more accessible because now you can play it, you can learn, you can take your time. But it doesn't ruin the depth at all, because it didn't really touch the core game. But, another example would be like, imagine if we got rid of item combining, and now items were just, here's your full item, put it on somebody. That could make the game more accessible, but it could also make the depth a lot less interesting, because then it just becomes, well, I got a blue buff, I put it here. There's no optionality. There's no interesting decisions, And so I think the modern trend in the industry isn't that games are easier, it's that people are trying to figure out what accessible means and what that definition of accessible is. I think accessibility, when crafted correctly, is great. Hilariously enough, Dark Souls is obviously the more interesting debate here, because Dark Souls is not what I would call an accessible game, but in a way it actually is, because Dark Souls obviously kicks your teeth in when you first start playing it, but as you explore the game and get understanding of it, there's actually a lot of ways to make the game very simple, whether it be crazy one-shot builds or whatever. Like, I've definitely seen some streamers be like, oh yeah, I beat Dark Souls, and it's like, well, yeah, because you decided to make it as easy for yourself as possible, which is fine, right? Like, even Dark Souls has done some crafting around their systems so that there are lots of ways to approach it. Compare that to something like, I don't know, the Ninja Gaiden, the Xbox version, where it was like, no, when you get to a hard boss, like, you have to beat it. There's a specific way you have to beat it. There's no tricks. That's an inaccessible game. So I think DK Bonanza is the culmination of years of Nintendo's exploration into what accessibility means. And I do think there's going to be people like myself, actually, as a gamer, that are going to be like, well, this is too easy. And they don't want to necessarily have to make the game harder for themselves in their own way. But I've been trying to do that a little bit lately. Trying to find places in DK where I can push the limits of the game. I've definitely seen a couple videos of people like sequence breaking. Like, I saw one video where someone was able to skip past the Pauline intro and break some of their sound files, which I thought was interesting. So, yeah. So TLDR, do I think there's a trend of games getting easier? No. I think people are trying to figure out how to make games accessible. It's just a lot of people are behind the curve on what that means and don't think of the repercussions of, if they do that, what that means to the skill depth. I think you look at a lot of games that are maybe trying to copy TFT or card games or whatever. There are versions that are more accessible, but with less depth, less stickiness. And I will say, I've even had at least one of my bosses tell me that sometimes I try to make TFT too accessible, and my solutions aren't necessarily the sticky types of solutions, which I challenge a bit, but it's at least something I keep on my mind, It's at least something I try to be cognitive of, just to make sure. So, but that goes back to the thing where casuals say I make things too hardcore. Hardcore people say things I make too casual, which means I'm probably pretty close to the right spot. So there you go. All right. Before set 15 came to PBE, I had told a brief story about a 2 cost that I looked at and then was pretty confident it was underpowered. And then the team talked to me a little bit and we adjusted it. And someone was asking, what was that 2 cost? And the answer was Jin. There was a playtest where I looked at Jin because I was doing my rounds of like checking out the characters. And Jin had that 0.75% attack speed, 4th shot, big damage, like that he has right now. Nothing changed. But it was literally like there was no AS scaling. And so what I said was, I looked at this and I was like, guys, how does somebody who every 5 seconds fires a big 4th shot, how does he ever win a stage 8 fight? And so that particular playtest I'm like, hey, Aniko, why don't you try to play Jin 3? And then he did, and right around 3-6, he started going, oh, I see the problem. It's like, yeah. So Jin, we've learned this a lot over the years, and I think Ari suffers from this as well a little bit, is that single target spells have to be fast, because in the late game, there are 8 things you have to kill, some of which are tanks at their biggest degree. And so the spell design for single target stuff in the late game is really tough. One of the ways we've solved this is overkill damage, right? A lot of our one costs, like Kindred in set 14, are like, well, if I hit the single target really hard, I'll have overkill damage so that at least it's not wasted. Because a lot of this, by the way, is learnings from Yumi from set 8. Now, Yumi solved this by going, I'm just going to skip the tanks, which is probably the least healthy version that we've ever made. But I think this is actually one of the things that worried with me about Caitlyn in KO Coliseum. If you don't have Battle Academia in, I was like, she's non-functional. She's just going to be a 75 mana single target spell. That's never going to work. Now, the answer there could just be it's fine. If you're playing Caitlyn, you need Battle Academia. Okay, fine, I suppose. I think Ari is another example where we've seen a bunch of overkill damage doesn't really help. Now, Ari's overkill damage isn't actually overkill damage, which is why she's kind of terrible in Sorcerers from what we've seen, and much better in Star Guardian, where she's just constantly generating mana and doing other damage. So those are the things you have to think about, though, when you're designing spells. You can't just be like, ooh, this is a cool spell. You have to be, how are they supposed to win fights? And so in Jin's case, it was very clear to me that like a 4th shot every 5 seconds, if you invest in that, you're never winning a fight. Now, at the time, there was a playtest where like the team showed me like, no, Jin's doing well. Though looking back on it, I would attribute that to being Wraith being powerful. And that was the part that I hadn't considered. Was like, well, yeah, the Jin's 4th shot hits the front line for 4,000 damage. But then that 4,000 damage, let's say you're playing 6 Wraith, 2,000 damage gets hit to the 3 targets, and like that can hit backline. And so that's actually what making Jin not single target is his Wraith ability, because Wraith allows him to actually skip some of that front line, and overkill damage is good because it gets projected into that trait, provides extra healing. And so that was the part I hadn't quite considered fully at the time, was how much of an impact Wraith could have on Jin. But that being said, as you see, we did add some more AS to the 3-star version to give ourselves that lever in case Jin doesn't actually work. You can give him more and more attack speed until he does. And I'll also say, since then, Wraith has been nerfed pretty heavily, which means we're back into a world where a lot of his power is within his 4th shot, which goes back to that same sort of challenge. And this is the kind of stuff that, like I said, at least, before I left, and probably when and if I get back, I'll have to be teaching more of, is like, how do you recognize this stuff so that it doesn't go all the way from a set designer to playtest to finalization to Mort's check, and then you still have this incredibly slow champion that can't kill anything, right? I need more people to recognize that before it gets to me. That's the goal. But yeah, so Jin was the 2 cost. Single target spells are scary. You have to put a lot of work in to make single target spells work, or they have to be very spammy. Set 10 KDA Ari was like, what, 30 or 20 mana? Like, she was spamming that thing like crazy. And so in a way, those kind of casters become like AD champions, right? This is why AD champions are generally just more... And here's the dirty secret, okay? I think during set 14, near the end, a lot of people were seeing more success with AD champions. And they noticed that AD champions are generally performing better. Damage meters have done a little bit of irreparable damage to our perception of how the game works. And I'll give you, Ari is actually, KO Coliseum Ari is the perfect example of this. People look at KO Coliseum Ari and they see big damage numbers on the meters. They see 20,000 damage, 25,000 damage. and they're like, this AP character seems broken. But AP champions have the most inherent risk of overkill damage. And it's why I've been pushing for a while that, like, man, what we really need is an overkill damage meter to, like, hide overkill damage. Because then what happens is someone goes, hey, Ari's OP. Like, if you compare Ari to, I don't know, pick an AD champion. We'll say Caitlyn or something. That's how I need an AD attacker. Smolder. Yeah, even Smolder's a caster. Who's the AD attack? Who's the Ginsu's users? Why am I blanking? Anyway, whatever the AD user is, right? Like, the AD user will do, you know, much less damage than Ari, and then people will think they need to be equal, and then the AD user outperforms because it's all valuable damage through their auto attacks and stuff like that. So I've noticed there's an inherent biases that people react strongly, even within our team, that when AP champions do strong things, people freak out a little bit and feel like it needs to be nerfed. That I'm not sure how to solve, but I do think it's why AP champions struggle a bit more. And it's why I think, like, Seraphine versus Yone are why they are right now. So, because Yone in particular wastes, like, no damage. That dude just auto attacks like crazy. And if he's ever doing a lot of damage, you know that is, like, very little overkill damage. So yeah, there you go. All right. I don't know if I'm going to get through both of these. I had 2 more questions. I think I'm only getting through one. All right. What are the biggest wins and the biggest challenges with Roles Revamped now that they've been on PvE? Now, obviously, I haven't played as deeply as I normally do. I've mostly played on stream, a little off stream. But here's what I'll say so far. I think the biggest wins are that it solves a lot of really unintuitive, we just talked about accessibility. It solves a lot of really unintuitive rules in TFT. Like, hey, don't do backline damage because you're just feeding them mana. That was weird. And so now it's okay to hit backlines, and that's good. I think having mana regen as a stat is valuable and a big win. I think AD tooltips now actually just saying our spell does this much damage. Great. Much more readable, much more accessible. So, and now the scaling actually looks like it makes sense, right? No more of this 200% AD spells. It's like, no, it actually says 300, 450. And that's a big win. When it comes to digestibility and understandability of a game, those are big wins. I think the aggro system is minor. I wouldn't call it a huge win right now, but it's okay. The fact that, like, you can position, like, I don't know if you guys have started doing this, but make sure your melee carries have a tank to their left and the right so they don't get targeted. That's been cool. I've definitely pulled that off a couple times. So, feeling good about that. So there's some big wins there. I think some of the new items, like Giant Slayer, are feeling a lot better. Now, they might need some tuning, right? Like, let's say Challenger players are out there going, Giant Slayer's weak. Okay, then you raise the base damage amp or whatever, right? Like, I'm not going to say they're perfectly tuned, but I do think having an item that's actually, like, you can build on 2-1 and kill tanks easier, good stuff. So, like I said, I think there's a lot of wins there. Now, what are the biggest challenges? I think one of the big things we were trying to solve, and I think we did, but we opened up some new challenges, is melee champions. I think melee champions not being drain tanks is great. However, to make them succeed now, what we're seeing, at least on PB in my impression, is that melee champions are very good early, right? And a Fury 2 in stage 2, bonkers. Or a 2-item Viego in stage 2, even a Viego 1, just a 2-item Viego. Good luck. Solo leveling is just a ton of power, right? Like, Although solo leveling could just be tuning as well. But melee champions in the early game are very difficult to kill. But then you reach the late game, and this is why someone like Raptor is just constantly yelling about how Edge of Night is required. Late game, they just kind of die. They die fast. They get blown up very, very quickly. Now, some of this could be tuning. Some of this could be how much damage caps, trait power, power-ups, yada, yada, yada. There could be a lot of causes for this, but the cold reality right now is that most melee champions struggle in the late game. There are exceptions, of course. Darius having 4,000 health and constantly healing to full is a nice example of an exception. But like, I tried to make Yasuo work multiple times, and that dude just gets popped. You know, anytime I tried to play him, even with an Edge of Night, Gangplank is similar. And the other thing what that's doing is making any of the Sniper's Focus versions much more powerful. Like, I got roasted by a triple Sniper's Focus Gangplank this weekend, and that thing was insane, right? And so because you're trying to make them melee champions, you have to power vary them around being melee champions, right? They have to have low mana costs and high damage. That's to make up for their inherent weakness of being on the front line. But the more we've done that now, the more RFC and Sniper's Focus have become more valuable. Because now they don't need to take damage, right? Like, before, you would never Sniper's Focus a melee champion because, like, Fiddlestick, well, that's not a good example, but there were definitely melee champions that you wouldn't want to be ranged because it would take them too long to cast because they weren't taking any damage. That's just not true anymore, right? And so a ranged Gangplank is always going to be way better. And so now here's the scary part, is like, balance-wise, I would say something outrageous like maybe under Roles Revamped, Sniper's Focus and RFC shouldn't exist. But then that's where it's like, well, then this whole system made the game less fun. Having ranged melee champions was cool. You've made the game less fun. Don't do it, you know? And that's one of those like hard conversations that, you know, if Blue Velvet's watching right now, he's like cringing in his sleep that why did we make this system if it's just going to make melee champions never allowed to be ranged? Which I don't think it's that extreme, to be clear, but I do think maybe having Gwen's scissors get bigger with range was a tough play, you know? But certainly, like, Yone in particular was one I think we knew. And in fact, I know the finalization team, there's a power-up called Stretchy Arms. And it used to give you default +2 range. Woo! Clearly broken. And so I think right now you don't get any range until you start getting takedowns, which is probably the most balanced version. But yeah. So I think the melee champions is the biggest one. And I think the second one I would say is probably just item balance. My guess is item balance right now is kind of all over the place. I know some people have been complaining about how, like, Bloodthirster doesn't have as much of a point anymore. It's just not a good item now that you don't need to heal as much. I've heard, you know, Giant Slayer we talked about earlier. The Giant Slayer might not be in the right spot. Is Titans too strong? I know initial impressions were yes, but also I haven't really seen that many get built anymore. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Or maybe it's only strong in the early game, you know. Like, there's probably a lot of item balance work to do there of like, but the nice thing is that's like easy stuff. It's just like, dumb example here, but let's say Bloodthirster was a problem. You could put something on it that was like, every auto attack heal 100 flat health. And it's like, I don't know, or, you know, up the damage or whatever. Like, there's a bunch of solutions. It's not a hard space. It's just something that would need to be done, would be balance out the items. So I think those are the big ones. Oh, and I think, you know, the last one is just like the effects. Like, do we have the effects right? Should a melee fighter be getting 20% Omnivamp? Maybe, maybe not. Should assassins be getting something else? Maybe. Are casters supposed to, instead of being 7 mana per auto and 2 mana regen, supposed to be 5 mana per auto and 3 mana regen. Maybe, right? Like, these are the things that I think, like, I would be skeptical we got it perfect the first time. But those are also the kind of things that I don't worry about because those are easy fixes, right? Like, when you have levers like that, you can just adjust the levers as needed. So those don't scare me. But the melee one, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. So I think those are the things that jump out. All right, got through 3 questions today. There was a 4th one. I didn't get to it. I'm sorry. But yeah, hope it's Monday. You never know. Definitely going to be a weird week. I'm in LA next week. Next week, I have to fly out for a leadership thing again. So I'll be there. I fly out Monday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm there. Where I'll be, I won't be able to do walk the dog because it's not actually on the Riot campus. It's on a different place. And so you might just get videos of me sitting in my hotel room next week. But calling that out. And then Friday, my flight's actually very early, so you might not get a Friday episode, or I have to record it like the night before or something like that. This is how my brain works, by the way. I just plan stuff early in advance so I know how I'm going to tackle it. Shouldn't affect streams. And then who knows? Who knows what's coming in the future? Feels like things are always changing. You know, months ago I talked about a curveball. Well, maybe this time it's a fastball. Maybe this time it's a knuckleball. You never know. I'll keep you guys posted. Again, maybe I'm more communicative than I should be, but I hope you guys, like I said, I don't know. I'm hoping that the people who watch this leave more informed and more positive than before they watch these. So that's my hope. I like these things. So, all right, that's gonna do it for me. I'm gonna head to get some breakfast, get to work, and get ready. So, all right, that's gonna do it for me. Until next time, take it easy.